My name is Annie Caping, and I'm a senior researcher at the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions at the Erasmus University Rotterdam. Key to the work that we do at the Dutch Research Institute for Transitions is not just to research sustainability transitions, but to contribute and engage with them as well. Through our research, consultancy, and education, we co-create knowledge together with diverse societal actors. By engaging with actors like municipalities, businesses, NGOs, and citizens, we try to not only better understand transitions, but also to support societal actors in navigating them. So by now, you have heard others in previous modules talk about the climate and ecological crisis we are facing. When it comes to climate change, we're moving towards the point of no return. Biodiversity loss and destruction of ecosystems continue at alarming rates, and the impacts of these are unequally divided across people across the planet, with the most vulnerable hit the hardest. In other words, it is clear that sustainability transitions are urgently needed. And to address these issues, we need to radically change the ways we approach and interact with systems. And in order to shape systems that deliver the functions we require, they need to be based on values of sustainability, justice, and prosperity, rather than on values like extractivism and accumulation. But it's difficult to find a way forward in the complexity of diverse, intertwined systems, people, and places. In the work that we do at DRIF, we build on transition thinking to make sense of what is happening, but also to derive insights on how to move forward and even to engage in sustainability transitions. That is why I will share some of our main insights about navigating transitions with you in this video. I will start by explaining some of the core ideas behind transition thinking. Then I'll outline why the non-linearity of societal change makes sustainability challenges so difficult to address. And finally, I'll present the X-curve framework. This is a framework used to identify where we currently are in a transition and what steps we might take to further navigate it. But let's start at the beginning. Transition. What does that mean? Well, transitions are processes of fundamental change, or put literally, change from one system to another. For example, from a system that is based on fossil fuels to a system based on renewables. However, the tricky thing about transitions is that when you're in the midst of one, it can be very hard to tell how far along it is and where it's headed. However, in hindsight, transitions are much easier to spot. Take, for example, the transition from horse and carriage to automobiles. Because at the start of this transition, it may not have been so obvious that cars would become the next new dominant form of transportation in little over a decade. Instead, people may have been looking for ways to make horses go faster. But it's in hindsight that we can see a clear transition from a transportation system based on horses to one based on automobiles. And this change in systems led to obvious visible changes to the overall structure of the system, like the infrastructures that cater specifically to cars, or the layout of cities where lots of space is now devoted to parking cars. But the car has also changed how we think about transportation. It has influenced rules and regulations, and it has even shaped the way people live their lives today. And in transition thinking, this dominant system that has a strong influence on society are called a regime. Something is considered a regime when it has a dominant influence on the structures, culture, and practices of a particular societal system. So, for example, in the case of the car, it has strongly influenced the structures of the system, making it difficult to travel around with relative ease if you do not own a car. Culture-wise, the car still remains a symbol of freedom, but also one of class and prestige. While practice-wise, many people have built their routine around the car, making it hard to even imagine taking other transportation options. And dominant regimes are not necessarily bad. Regimes bring stability and some level of predictability to a system. However, when regimes are built on and continue to foster more extractive and unsustainable practices, there is a need for a regime shift. So, in conclusion, transitions are processes of long-term fundamental change of dominant structures, cultures, and practices within a system, like the transition from horse and carriage to cars. And perhaps we're already halfway another transition, one that is not entirely visible today. But in their essence, transitions are just processes of change. They're neither good nor bad. But reflecting on the challenges that we're facing today, we're in need of sustainability transitions, not just any transitions. So what makes something a sustainability transition? When a long-term fundamental process of system change results in sustainable societies, we talk about sustainability transitions. They aim to address persistent sustainability challenges, like the challenges talked about in earlier modules, and they try to enable change toward regimes that are based on sustainable values. I'd like you to reflect on what transitions you contribute to, for example, through your personal daily practices or perhaps through your studies. And how do these transitions relate to sustainability transitions? All right, so we've known about these issues, the issues that we face for quite a long time. And people have been coming up with more sustainable practices and solutions as well. So then why is achieving change so difficult? To better understand that, we need to take a closer look at our societal systems, as the wiring of societal systems makes that transitions become hard to manage and predict. And this is because societal systems are understood as complex adaptive systems. Here, complex means that the system behaves in a way that cannot be predicted by studying its individual parts and relationships. In other words, it's the interconnections between elements within a system that results in a particular outcome of the system. And adaptive means that a system continuously adapts to a changing environment, that it evolves. For example, how a plant adapts by growing towards the light. And this type of thinking originates from biology. For example, observing the behavior of an individual ant does not necessarily tell you anything about how they behave as a colony. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. For example, ants can organize themselves to produce structures much more complicated than one ant could, as the ants in this photo illustrate. Or take, for example, this murmuration of birds. Birds form a murmuration through a combination of interactions between the individual birds that interact with each other. Without one bird taking the lead, they move as a group in a certain direction. But this also means that it's virtually impossible for these birds to plan a particular shape like that, leading to a continuously morphing and unpredictable shape. And our societies are much like these murmurations. We're just messing about left and right, and we each make some changes. This all adds up to the collective behavior that moves in an unpredictable direction. And this is what makes our society and change within it difficult to manage. So realizing that societies are complex adaptive systems means that there are some insights to draw. The key one being that impacts of interventions introduced into the system become uncertain and unpredictable, meaning it is hard to tell if something is a solution or whether the characteristics of the wider system result in unintended consequences. And because of that, society should not be considered as something that can be controlled or fixed, and societal change should not be thought of as something that can be planned in a linear fashion. But complex adaptive systems also provide insights into how societal change can be navigated. First, a small gesture can have a large impact. While one bird in the larger murmuration cannot define their exact shape, one bird could have a large impact on the overall direction that the entire group takes. This is also called the butterfly effect. And second, ecology teaches us the importance of diversity and experimentation. The survival of the fittest shows that adaptation suitable for a complex system can be found through trial and error. While one species might go extinct because of an adapted environment, continuous adaptation of species might result in it having evolved into one or even more species that thrive well in the new context. Interventions or climate action that fail to take these insights into account often become part of the problem and further lock in persistent problems. Because seeing society as fixable and change as plannable opens up to addressing persistent problems with superficial solutions. And this starts with a focus on improvement of the existing or a search for so-called solutions or tech fixes that all fail to address the root causes of unsustainability. Think, for example, of the electric car. While it is an improvement of the fossil fuel car and addresses some of its key issues, it does not question or change many of the other system components, like the dominance it has on our infrastructure and city planning, or the extractive nature of the industry producing these electrical vehicles. And not only do such superficial solutions feed path dependency, they will ultimately leave the system locked in unsustainability. So from complexity theory, a number of principles for transition thinking emerge. Transitions are non-linear, shockwise processes of change that are hard to predict and control. Sustainability requires more than the scaling of technological innovation or solutions. And last, experimentation, diversity, and reflexivity are key characteristics for pathways towards sustainability. Can you think of an example where an intervention did not have the expected impact because the system was more complex than assumed? So with these lessons in mind, let's return to sustainability transitions. And how do we move from an unsustainable regime to a more sustainable one? And this starts with an assessment of what values we would like embedded in our future desired system. Take, for example, the food system. The core function of the food system is to deliver food and nutrition security. But rather than doing that predominantly based on values of efficiency and commodification, we want to move to a food system that delivers food and nutrition security in a sustainable, equitable, accessible, and culturally inclusive way. Building systems based on different values also leads to systems based on different types of practices and ways of thinking. And much like the evolutions of birds adapting to a changing environment, so do new alternative practices emerge in a system. They emerge through people that think of alternative ways of thinking, doing, and organizing the system, and who just start experimenting with these new practices on their own, like different ways to grow food. For example, growing food in the city, where fresh and sustainable produce is more readily available to people from various socioeconomic backgrounds, and where the production of food also contributes to a greener city. Building on values of community, sustainability, and equality results in very different practices that we now see as dominant in our food system. And in transition thinking, we call these practices niches. A niche is an alternative practice that can challenge dominant ways of doing, otherwise known as the regime. And these niches do that by providing alternative ways of thinking, doing, and organizing the system, by centering them on alternative values, values like justice, the commons, or well-being. And ultimately, niches hope that by growing, multiplying, and translating themselves to other contexts, they can become a new regime. Much like the car started out as an alternative practice to horse and carriages, although obviously the car did not build on values of environmental sustainability. A niche practice that does build on values of sustainability is that of herenboeren. Herenboeren is a Dutch cooperative movement focused on sustainable and community-driven agriculture. The organization supports groups of families and individuals in collectively owning and managing small-scale farms, where they produce a variety of food for their own consumption. It reimagines the food system by building practices that build on values very different from those dominant in the current food system. It encourages the shift away from industrial, resource-intensive agriculture and towards more sustainable and community-based approach to producing food. Having already established and continuing to grow throughout the Netherlands, Herenboeren is an excellent example of a niche that ultimately hopes to become a new, more sustainable regime. Can you think of one or more niche practices that are visible in the transition you identified before? Finally, we turn to the X-curve framework, a model that is designed to make these complex dynamics visible by visualizing the build-up and breakdown that make up transitions towards a new system. But before we dive into it, it's good to realize that all models are wrong, but that some are useful. In other words, this model is not the model that rules them all, but it's helpful in understanding the dynamics that shape transitions. So let's continue the example of Herenboeren, a niche practice that builds on values of sustainability and community in order to give shape to a more social and sustainable food system. A transition can look like this classic S-curve. But at DRIF, we know this picture is still incomplete because we need to look at the entire system. And when we talk about a system, what do we miss in this picture? Well, exactly, the regime or the mainstream ways of doing. So in this transition, what happens to the intensive fossil-based agriculture system? Should they also stay? While the S-curve nicely shows the buildup of a system, it doesn't show how we go about dismantling the old system, the system that we'd like to get rid of. So in short, there is no transition without loss, turmoil, and breakdown. Without breakdown, there is no buildup. So we speak of an X-curve rather than an S-curve. And the X-curve that we have developed at DRIF shows an ideal type of transition, or in other words, an analytical model. There are two key takeaways from the X-curve. First, it is important to realize that transitions are both about build-up and breakdown, especially since we prefer thinking about what to add to a system rather than what should be taken out or demolished. And second, it is key to have an idea of what we want to move towards. So where would we as a society or a group of people like to end up when the transition is completed? So let's look at the X-curve with another example. At the top left, we find the existing practices and cultures that need to be changed. For example, the construction of asphalt without greenery. At the bottom left, we find the emerging niches, the innovation, the innovative ways of doing, thinking, and organizing. For example, the joint management of a community garden instead of a parking lot. At the top right, we find the innovations that have already normalized, the institutionalized innovations. For example, the mini facade gardens that you can find all around Rotterdam at the street level. And at the bottom right, we find the phase out of the regime. There you will find the regime structures that have already been demolished. For example, the demolition of major motorways in the city, like has been done in the city center of Utrecht. When taken together, they show the X-curve, a snapshot of where we are in the transition today. And it might show that there is already a lot of activity in terms of experimentation, but that we have not paid sufficient attention to the phase out of the old regime yet. And in doing so, it gives you insights on where and to what you should pay attention next to accelerate transitions. So what then is the added value of looking at transitions through the X-curve framework? First, it helps you to focus on breakdown in transitions, which is rather difficult. If you do this together with a group of people, you can co-create a transition narrative together. It also allows you to reflect on your position in transition. For example, are you working on studying to help support niches, or will you focus on the institutionalization of new practices and structures? Last, by showing a snapshot of the transition today, the X-curve is a helpful tool in strategic planning of transitions. However, in real life, of course, transitions are much more complex. No sharp X-curves, but meandering pathways that run through each other. Are there processes related to breakdown of the regime in the transition you identified before? All right, to conclude, there are a number of key takeaways from this video. First, sustainability transitions are fundamental processes of change towards sustainable systems, change from one system to another. But societal change is complex, and this means that change, as well as society, cannot be controlled or predictive. However, taking lessons from ecology, by opting for diversity and experimentation, our chances in transformative success increase. Lastly, sustainable transitions require both build-up and breakdown, especially since we prefer thinking of what to add rather than what to take out. The X-curve framework is a tool that helps conceptualizing transitions as patterns of build-up and breakdown and to identify what steps can be taken to support and navigate transitions. If this video has left you wanting for more information about sustainability transitions and what you can do, beside the more conceptual work on transitions, we also do action research projects, advisory projects for business, governments, and NGOs, and we offer professional education and have lots of free resources available on our website. Do check out our website or reach out to me or one of my colleagues if you're interested in learning more about transitions or our work.